The world's highest slopes remember every foolish choice. From a climber who removed his gloves just for a minute, unaware the cold above 27,000 feet measures time differently, to an influencer who trusted a dying camera battery more than the dwindling oxygen keeping him alive. From a solo camper who placed his tent on a perfect viewpoint carved into thin air, to a veteran guide who stepped off the official route, convinced he could outsmart the shifting ice beneath him. But first, the team that stayed too long on the summit ridge, celebrating through thin air as the jet stream crawled toward them, turning triumph into a trap they never escaped. Story number 1. It was May 23, 2019, on the balcony of Mount Everest, at roughly 27,500 feet. The morning light was sharp enough to carve shadows into the snow, yet the air felt unusually calm. No wind, no blowing crystals, just a cold stillness that made the mountain seem momentarily gentle. Climbers often mistake that quiet for safety. Up here, calm is not kindness, it is camouflage. Two figures were moving slowly toward the south summit, clipped into the fixed rope that stretched across a narrow, angled traverse. The man in front, 41-year-old David Whitmore from Utah, had stopped briefly on a small shelf carved into the slope. His helmet camera had shifted during the climb, tilting too far left. He wanted to fix it before the final push. It seemed like nothing, a small inconvenience at the edge of the death zone. To adjust the mount, he removed his right glove, only for a moment, only for a quick adjustment, only for a few seconds, as he told his partner behind him. His climbing partner, McCall, reacted instantly, his voice strained through the oxygen mask. He warned David that bare skin doesn't survive long at this altitude. Even in good weather, exposed flesh can freeze in under 2 minutes. But David ignored him. He had handled winter storms before. He believed he understood the cold. He believed he could beat the clock. He couldn't. Within 90 seconds, frostbite began its silent work. The skin on David's knuckles turned pale, then white. Moisture from his breath crystallized across his fingertips, forming a fragile lace of frost. At first, he didn't notice. Numbness arrives quietly here, without pain, without alarm, without mercy. When he tried to slip his glove back on, his fingers wouldn't bend. They slid stiffly along the inside lining, unable to grip or curl. He shook his hand, trying to force warmth back into it. Nothing responded. McCall offered to help, but David refused, insisting he was fine. He kept struggling, wasting more precious seconds, unaware that he was crossing a line the human body cannot cross twice. When they resumed climbing, the damage had already taken hold. David's right hand was useless. He tried to clip into the fixed line, but the carabiner slipped from his stiff fingers and clattered down the slope, disappearing into a thin plume of powder. Panic flickered across his breathing. He reached for a backup, fumbling blindly, hands trembling inside the cold-soaked gloves he still hadn't secured properly. The balcony sits on a steep angle, and every step demands precision. Without full hand control, even clipping into a rope becomes a fight. David's boots scraped against the ice, searching for footholds he should have felt instantly. His movements grew sharp, uncertain. McCall shouted for him to stop, but altitude had already begun eroding David's judgment. The fear of losing his fingers had become the fear of losing control. Then came the final mistake. David stepped forward to reach the anchor point ahead, but his right glove slipped halfway off again, dangling uselessly from his wrist. Instinctively, he reached down with the same bare hand to pull it back on. His weight shifted. His crampons skated across a shallow crust of snow. He lost balance. There was no scream, no dramatic plunge, just a sudden, silent slide. He tumbled down slope, bouncing against the icy surface before disappearing behind a ridge of wind-carved snow. McCall is called out again and again, his voice swallowed by the thin air. Hours later, a Sherpa team ascending toward the balcony found David's body partially buried in a shallow drift. His hands were frozen solid, fingers locked in rigid curves. One glove lay a few feet away, still open, its fabric stiffened with frost. The other hung from his harness strap, never properly secured. Medical teams would later estimate that he had lost hand function within minutes, long before he fell. Cold this intense doesn't warn. It doesn't negotiate. It simply takes what's exposed. For all his experience, David never understood that in the death zone, time works differently. A single decision made in comfort becomes a fatal one seconds later. Up here, even a brief moment of carelessness, A glove removed just for a minute can strip a climber of their grip, their balance, and their life before they realize what's happening. He believed he could handle the cold. Everest proved otherwise. 3 years later, another climber would make a different mistake in the same thin air, trusting not his hands, but the battery of a machine that failed him when he needed breath the most. Story number 2. It was May 21st, 2022, on the upper southeast ridge of Mount Everest, just below the south summit at roughly 28,500 feet. Dawn had barely touched the horizon, but the sky was already glowing with a thin strip of gold stretching over the Tibetan plateau. Most climbers pushed hard here, eager to summit before the winds rose. But one man lingered, 29-year-old adventure vlogger Nick Hale from Vancouver. Nick had built a modest online following documenting extreme landscapes with drones, action cameras, and cinematic sunrise shots. This moment, this angle, this light, was the footage he believed would finally blow up his channel. His Sherpa reminded him they were behind schedule, that the summit window was closing, that oxygen levels were dropping fast. But Nick hardly listened. His eyes were locked on the tiny red battery indicator flashing on his camera screen. He had only a few minutes of battery left, and only a little more oxygen than that. But instead of switching to a fresh cylinder, instead of continuing the climb or beginning the descent, he set his pack down on a narrow snow ledge and lifted the camera toward the rising sun. He told himself it would be quick, just one more shot, just one more pan across the ridgeline, just one more clip for the vlog. Up here, people die inside those just one more moments. Nick spoke into the camera, breath fogging the lens, voice strained through the oxygen mask. He described the colors behind him, the wind patterns, the altitude. His Sherpa urged him again, this time louder, more desperate, to move. The mountain doesn't wait. But Nick brushed him off, raising a finger to signal silence as he reframed another shot. Minutes slipped by, and with them, oxygen. His Sherpa checked his gauge, dangerously low. Nick's own regulator hissed unevenly, ice forming around the valve. He noticed none of it. He was watching the camera battery drop from 5% to 4% to 3%. Another gust hit the ridge, carrying thin powder across his boots. Climbers above them called out warnings, storm bands forming earlier than forecast. The sun was bright, but the light was changing, flattening. Filming conditions were declining. Descent time was slipping away. Still, he stayed. When he finally turned to pack his gear, he hesitated. The camera battery had dropped to 2%. He wanted one final clip, the dramatic close-up, he called it. He crouched again, adjusting settings with gloved fingers stiff from cold. That small delay sealed his fate. His oxygen alarm chimed softly at first, then louder, echoing through the plastic of his mask. Nick waved it off like it was an annoyance, not a warning. Altitude had begun eroding his judgment, softening the edges of logic. He pulled the mask slightly aside to speak clearly into the camera, unaware he was letting precious air escape into the wind. Within minutes, his breath sharpened. His movements slowed. His words began slurring, drifting into half-formed phrases. His Sherpa tried to force a new cylinder into his hands, but Nick pushed it away, mumbling that he could finish the descent without oxygen. It wasn't bravado. It was the confusion of a brain starving. He didn't understand what he was saying. He staggered while trying to stand. His legs folded beneath him, and he sank to his knees, still pointing the camera upward as the battery flashed 1%. The view recorded by the lens tilted. Sky, ridge, sunlight bleeding through blowing frost. Nick's breathing grew harsh, then desperate, a wet rattle caught inside the mask. He lifted the camera one more time, staring at the fading screen, as if the number on it mattered more than the numbers on his oxygen gauge. Then he collapsed. The camera tumbled from his hand, landing lens first into the snow. It continued recording, shaking slightly in the wind, capturing fragments of his final moments, his gloved fingers twitching weakly, frost swirling across the frame, and the faint sound of him gasping, still trying to check the battery indicator, even as consciousness slipped away. When rescuers found him hours later, he was slumped beside the rock ledge, mask frozen, regulator blocked with ice. The camera was retrieved from beneath a thin crust of snow. Its last file was corrupted except for a few seconds. Nick kneeling, breathing heavily, trying to steady the camera for a final shot he would never upload. In the death zone, technology can extend your reach, document your journey, even give you a voice where none should exist. But if you trust it more than your own survival, it cuts that journey short. 3 days later, another climber would set his camp in a spot no one else wanted, not because it was safe, but because it looked beautiful under moonlight. The mountain would show him what beauty hides at altitude. Story number 3. It was April 3rd, 2017, on the upper Kongshung face of Mount Everest, at roughly 25,000 feet, a place where the mountain feels quieter than anywhere else. Quiet in the way graveyards are quiet. Most climbers camp farther inland, away from the edges and overhangs that shift during the night. But one man preferred the view over the safety. 37-year-old British alpinist and photographer Thomas Gray had spent years chasing perfect sunrises across the world's highest ranges. For him, a photograph wasn't just an image, it was proof of presence, a way to show he had stood somewhere few others dared. When he saw the small, windswept platform near the cornice lip, he knew instantly that was where he wanted to set his tent. The others in his mixed nationality team warned him the spot was unstable. Cracks had appeared after the last windstorm, spidering through the cornice and disappearing into shadow. Thomas smiled, said the anchors were solid, and that he only needed one clear sunrise. He believed beauty justified the risk. He secured his tent with precision, extra ice screws, a picket driven deep, and a tripod set at the entrance aimed toward the eastern horizon. The view was extraordinary. The ridge fell away into darkness, and beyond it, the silhouettes of Makalu and Lhotse carved jagged lines into the sky. It was the kind of vantage point climbers dream of, and the kind they usually avoid because it shouldn't exist. When night fell, temperatures dropped rapidly. The glacier beneath the cornice contracted, tightening around the tent's anchoring screws, with small snaps that echoed faintly through the floor. Thomas heard them, soft cracks, brittle pops, but dismissed them as ordinary glacier settling. He zipped his sleeping bag a little higher and reviewed the time-lapse settings on his camera, adjusting the intervalometer for the dawn sequence he wanted to capture. The tent fabric fluttered occasionally, then settled. The ridge was unnervingly still. Around 2 a.m., a faint tremor passed through the slope. Maybe a distant serac fall above, maybe shifting ice deeper inside the cornice. The vibration ran through the tent poles like a warning whispered through metal. Thomas lifted his head, listened for more, then lowered it again. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing ever seems wrong until the mountain decides to show its hand. As temperatures continued dropping, the snowpack beneath the cornice hardened and compressed. Micro cracks widened slowly, silently, inch by inch beneath the weight of his tent. Thomas slept unaware that the ground beneath him was no longer solid ice but a hollow shell, an air pocket waiting for the smallest shift. Just before dawn, the first light touched the horizon. Inside his tent, Thomas stirred. The cold had begun loosening its grip, and in that temperature change lay the final trigger. A thin line of fracture beneath the tent expanded, just a whisper, a sigh of snow stretching in the early light. The camera at the tent entrance captured it. The slightest tilt, the faintest shudder, the world shifting a few centimeters off level. Then everything let go. The cornice broke without drama. No explosion of sound, no avalanche roar. Just a smooth, sickening slide as the entire shelf beneath him detached from the mountain. The tent glided forward like a sled, still tethered to its anchors, still recording the horizon as it drifted into open air. Gravity took over. The first anchor ripped free, sending the tent into a slow roll. The second held for a moment, jerking the tent violently mid-air before snapping loose with a sharp crack, swallowed instantly by the wind. Thomas had no time to react. The entire structure fell as a single tumbling mass, bouncing down the icy face until it snagged against a fractured serac nearly 200 feet below. For several minutes, the camera continued recording, flashes of sky, slashes of white fabric whipping in the wind, faint groans of the tent poles twisting. The final frame froze on a slanted image of drifting snowflakes, falling through the pale orange light of sunrise. When his team woke and saw the torn edge of the cornice where his tent had been, they knew instantly what had happened. A search party descended carefully, probing the slope until they spotted a piece of orange nylon half buried in shadow. Reaching it was impossible. The serac it rested on was fractured, ready to collapse at the slightest pressure. A drone deployed later recovered the memory card, its footage intact, documenting the exact moment beauty turned to disaster. Thomas had chosen the most stunning viewpoint on the ridge. He never realized that on Everest, the most beautiful spots are often the most deadly. 3 years later, another climber would attempt a different shortcut, not for a view, but for time, and the mountain would erase him just as quickly. Story number 4. It was April 18, 2015, on the lower Khumbu icefall of Mount Everest, around 18,000 feet. A place that moves even when it looks still. The ice here isn't frozen, it's alive. It groans, shifts, settles, and breaks without warning, reshaping itself hour by hour. Most climbers treat this section with quiet fear, moving quickly, following the ladders and ropes laid out by the icefall doctors, the only people who truly understand this unstable maze. But not everyone respects the system. 46-year-old expedition leader Robert Hensley from Colorado had guided multiple Himalayan climbs. He'd summited Everest twice, and he had begun believing something dangerous, that his experience made him smarter than the mountain. That morning, ridgelines formed at the first ladder crossing. Dozens of climbers waited their turn as the sun lifted over the valley, warming the ice and sending faint cracks echoing through the glacier. Robert hated waiting. He paced impatiently, glancing left toward a closed-off section of the icefall, a narrow corridor marked by faded red flags. A route abandoned weeks earlier after deep fractures appeared overhead. His clients hesitated when he suggested cutting through it, but he flashed the confidence that only seasoned guides can wear convincingly. "It's fine," he said. "Saves us nearly an hour. The glacier shifts everywhere. This is no worse than the main route." Trust is powerful at altitude, especially when fear mixes with fatigue. His clients followed. They moved into the forbidden corridor, surrounded by towering walls of ice rising nearly 40 feet high. The light filtering between them cast eerie blue reflections across the uneven floor. Fresh powder drifted gently from above, not falling snow, but crumbs of ice shaken loose by something shifting overhead. Robert noticed but kept going, telling himself it was normal settling. But settling has a different sound. This was warning. As they progressed deeper, the groans of the glacier grew louder, low, throaty rumbles rolling through the frozen walls. One climber asked if they should turn back. Robert dismissed the concern with a short laugh, calling it typical icefall noise. In truth, he felt a coil of unease tightening in his chest, but pride pushed it down. He had led too many climbs to let fear make decisions for him now. Then the corridor narrowed, and the rope he'd fixed along the edge trembled slightly in his hand. A vibration passed through it, subtle but unmistakable. Above them, one of the massive seracs, a block of ice larger than a house, shifted a few inches. No one saw it clearly, but they felt it. A shift in air pressure, a tightening silence, the moment the mountain inhaled before speaking. Robert glanced up, saw a thin plume of ice dust drifting in a straight line from the serac's underside, and realized what it meant. The structure was detaching. "Move fast," he ordered, urgency cracking through his voice. He believed they could outrun it. They couldn't. The serac broke free with a sound that didn't resemble anything human ears should hear. Part thunder, part explosion, part the groan of a world tearing itself open. A white wall dropped from the sky, smashing into the glacier floor 50 feet ahead. The shockwave alone knocked one client to the ground. Another section sheared off seconds later, cascading through the corridor like a collapsing skyscraper made of blue ice. Ladders snapped. Anchors ripped free. Ropes whipped through the air like severed wires. Robert shouted for his team to run, but the command dissolved into the roar of falling ice. The corridor behind them disintegrated. The one ahead vanished under millions of pounds of collapsing seracs. It lasted less than 30 seconds, long enough for the mountain to erase every trace of the shortcut he'd chosen. When the ice settled, the entire passageway was gone, buried, crushed, flattened into a landscape no one recognized. The main route, barely a quarter-mile away, remained intact. Climbers there felt the tremor but saw nothing. Radios crackled with broken messages, fragments of Robert's call for help, swallowed by static and shifting snow. Attempts to reach the site were delayed for hours as the icefall continued to move unpredictably, opening fresh cracks and swallowing rope lines as fast as rescuers could set them. By the time a team finally reached the debris field, nothing could be done. The bodies were entombed under more than 20 feet of compacted ice, enough weight to crush steel, let alone bone. A single red climbing pack was found near a wide fissure, half buried, its fabric torn. It was one of Robert's clients, a marker, a reminder. Experienced guides often save lives on Everest, but experience can become arrogance, and arrogance cannot save anyone in the Khumbu icefall. A shortcut that should have saved an hour cost a lifetime. 3 seasons later, high on the summit ridge, another group would make a different kind of fatal dell. Story number 5. It was May 29th, 2021, on the south summit ridge of Mount Everest, roughly 28,700 feet above sea level, when 4 climbers reached the top far later than they should have. The standard summit turnaround time is noon. Anyone trained in high-altitude climbing knows that. Yet, by the time Sanjay Gurung, Ritesh Bhandari, Kiran Lama, and Nirmal Rai stepped onto the highest point on Earth, it was already 3:40 p.m. The view was magnificent, the wind surprisingly calm, the sky a pale halo fading over the Tibetan plateau, and for a moment, a long, dangerous moment, the mountain felt still, the kind of stillness that tricks climbers into forgetting where they are, into forgetting that the death zone does not reward pride, it only measures it. They had pushed through exhaustion, thin air, and brutal cold to get here. When they finally reached the summit, the emotion hit them like warmth they hadn't felt in hours. They hugged, shouted through their masks, took turns filming each other with trembling hands. Phones came out, gloves came off for quick photos, and the ridge filled with laughter that drifted faintly across the snow. Sanjay pulled out his phone to record a message for his daughter. Ritesh took panoramic videos for his sponsors. Kiran lay back for a moment, staring at the sky, whispering, "I can't believe we did it." They filmed everything, their faces, the ridge, the 360-degree horizon, as if they had time to spare, as if the mountain wasn't warning them in its own silent way. Elongated shadows, a faint haze thickening below, wind plucking at the snow like a rehearsed prelude to something worse. Below them, at Camp 4, forecasters had been tracking a jet stream surge moving in from the west, gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour predicted after 4 p.m. Radios crackled with warnings, but the ridge was steep and winds carried sound away before it reached them. And even if it had, none of them were in a state to process new dangers. They were intoxicated with triumph, a high more blinding than altitude itself. Their oxygen gauges were already showing less than 1/3 capacity, but instead of starting the descent immediately, they lingered. One more video, one more group shot, one more slow sweep of the camera across the skyline. The minutes slipped by unnoticed until the first gusts arrived, brushing snow sideways along the ridge. Ritesh joked about it on camera, calling it Everest's applause. But Everest wasn't applauding. Everest was closing the window. By 4:45 p.m., visibility had dropped by half. A thin fog began rising from below, swirling upward as winds strengthened. Ice crystals collected on their mask valves. The ropes leading back toward the south summit turned stiff, frosting over until the colored fibers disappeared beneath white layers. They hesitated, but only briefly. Finally, they packed their gear and made their way toward the descent route. But the mountain had changed. Where there had been a visible line of crampon scratches and rope anchors just an hour earlier, there was now only white. A blank canvas of wind-blown snow erased every trace of the path. Their headlamps, though on, reflected back at them in a dense mist that made even a few feet impossible to see clearly. Nirmal went first, sweeping his ice axe back and forth, trying to locate the line. Kiran followed close behind. Sanjay and Ritesh stayed back to check for a secondary rope line near the cornice, one that occasionally offered a shorter route toward the south summit. They shouldn't have separated, not in a forming whiteout, not this high up. But panic and uncertainty breed bad decisions in the death zone. The storm arrived fully at 5:10 p.m. One moment they could still make out the faint outline of the ridge. The next, everything vanished into a swirling, suffocating blur of white. Wind screamed across the slope, drowning their voices. Snow moved horizontally, stinging exposed skin like needles. The ridge dissolved. The sky dissolved. Even the sense of up and down began to distort, making every direction feel wrong. Sanjay shouted for Ritesh, but the words were swallowed instantly. Ritesh shouted back, but his voice blew sideways into nothing. Kiran and Nirmal, farther ahead, managed to find partial shelter behind a bulge of ice. They crouched low, conserving oxygen, hoping the others were close behind. Hours passed like this, blind, freezing, barely breathing. Their cylinders hissed unevenly, ice forming around the valves. By nightfall, both were nearly out of O2. When a Sherpa rescue team reached them the next morning, they were alive but barely conscious, slumped against the ice as if asleep with their heads bowed. Their masks were frozen over, their gloves stiff. They were carried down by sheer luck, found only because their faint headlamp beams flickered through a brief break in the storm. Sanjay and Ritesh were not with them. 2 days later, their bodies were found still roped together beneath a cornice, partially buried,